Hello, honeys, and welcome to part 4 of Art That Pisses People Off, the Dada and Readymade episode. I expect this one to be especially interesting because so many of the artists, art movements, and artworks that we have talked about in the 20th century in this series thus far were either directly inspired by Dada or else were made possible by the standard of rule breaking that the movement set. A quick administrative sort of task to get through first, though. If you have been listening to our most recent episodes, then you know that we have a new series available. Titled The Honey Drop and meant to be a sort of extension and extra juicy monthly version of the business, it is available now on our Patreon for just a few dollars. You can find the links to our Patreon not only on our Instagram, but it will also soon be available through your regular streaming platforms. In the meantime, feel free to visit the Patreon page directly at patreon.com/highbrowhoney to find the episode and know that your contribution will be going directly towards making this podcast possible. And with that last announcement out of the way, let's go ahead and get funky. So, honeys, you may be asking yourself right off the bat, what exactly is Dada? Well, let's set the stage of the 1920s. Remember, as with almost every movement we've talked about in this series, once again, unprecedented times in literally every aspect of life. Technology, jazz, gender roles, travel, photography, movies becoming wider spread, common radios, etc. Life was changing left, right, and center. So of course they figured, screw the rules, screw everything, and just did whatever they wanted. It was the nihilism. One small important note before we get into the story though. New York Dada was much less overtly political than European Dada, and that has a lot to do with geography in this historical context-laden origin story. The term Dada as a word is nonsensical. It's originally a colloquial French one for a hobby horse, but in some languages it means literally yes, yes. In those specific contexts, it was more of a parody of the population's apparent senseless obedience to authority, though in others it had different meanings and connotations. The height of the movement was 1916 through 24. It originated in Switzerland before spreading to Paris and New York. Its key themes and characteristics were chance, luck, nonsense, humor tending towards the absurd, and satirical attitudes towards authority. It was heavy on collage and the ready-made. Art Story notes that it was influenced by many avant-garde movements from Cubism to Futurism to Expressionism, though its output was wildly diverse, everything from performance art to photography to sculpture came out of Dada. A lot of times, the Dada artists present really intriguing overlaps or paradoxes even. They included collaboration with chance through the arts of photography and airbrushing, as well as invented the entire technique genre of collage. This introduction of chance is especially important to the Dadaists because it allows them to challenge artistic norms by questioning the role of the artist in the artistic process. It goes against traditional art making processes where every bit of a work is planned out and completed just so. Art Story rather humorously notes, quote, "So intent were members of Dada on opposing all norms of bourgeois culture that the group was barely in favor of itself. Dada is anti-Dada, they often said," end quote. How Dada as a movement came to be in the lead up to World War I and through it, that is the most fascinating part of the story in my opinion. So let's do a speed run of it. World War I rolls around, and lots of artists, writers, intellectuals, and even just people who oppose the war in general go to seek refuge in Switzerland. The city of Zurich, in particular, becomes a big hub for exiled people, and it's there that two artists by the name of Hugo Ball and Emmy Hemmings open the Cabaret Voltaire on February 5th of 1916. We will circle back around to one of the performances Hugo Ball did there that was a really important moment for art history, but for the time being, important to note that cabaret was an important meeting and talking space for the most radical avant-garde artists of the day. As the war goes on, they become increasingly horrified by everything going on with it and anarchic on the whole, and essentially protest through their art under the movement of Dada. Dadaists were also very preoccupied by figuring out what the role of art was in the modern age. As much as they reacted against the rise of capitalist culture and the war in their artwork, they also raised serious questions about degradation of art. They wanted to contemplate its definition and its place in their new society. This is visible through the perspectives, the industrial age reflections in their artwork. The Dadaists mocked dehumanization with elaborate pseudo-diagrams that didn't necessarily explain how a thing worked, as well as objects that performed a purpose but not necessarily a helpful one. Furthermore, when Dadaists did choose to represent the human body, it was often mutilated or made to look manufactured or mechanical. In some artists' work, this was an explicit reference to the huge numbers of severely crippled veterans and growth of the prosthetics industry as a result of World War I. But the so-called Great War was not the only influence on their ideas. The Smithsonian Magazine articles I referenced for this episode detail that Freud, good old Freud, wrote that no event, quote, confused so many of the clearest intelligences or so thoroughly debased what is highest, end quote. Dada artwork presented an almost playful opportunity to embrace, to work with, to even parody that confusion. The MoMA describes it as an all-out assault against not only conventional definitions of art, but on rational thought itself. There are hints of Freud's ideas of symbology, for example, in the Dada perspective, that the aesthetic of their work is less important than the ideas that it conveys. In other words, even though he's most associated with surrealism, Freud inspired Dada as well, as artists tried to see objects in new ways, as they were attempting to understand the human mind in new ways or through new theories. They attempted to mine their own and the more general human subconscious. The Dadaists have left quite the legacy, though, as the movement proved to be one of, in the Smithsonian Magazine's words, the most influential in modern art, foreshadowing abstract and conceptual art, performance art, op, pop, and installation art. At the time, their bold new approaches to art stirred a lot of controversy within contemporary culture, especially because of their breaks from tradition. The Dadaists' willingness to make fine art into a sort of common thing or out of a common thing, and their constant pursuits of new ways to express ideas made them as many fans as it did foes. Some saw Dadaism as the next step forward in the avant-garde process. Others didn't quite get it and instead just saw the works, especially Duchamp's Readymades, as just junk. Unfortunately, that means that some originals ended up in the refuse pile and have been lost to history. But Dadaism was very much a product of its exact time. When World War I ended and World War II began to set its own stage, Dadaism started to lose steam. Though it was still popular with audiences into the 1920s, some individual artists, like Man Ray, found themselves moving towards the next big thing, such as surrealism. Others found the pressures on modern European artists too much to handle. Many more, rightfully, became fearful with the rise of Adolf Hitler to power in the 30s. That especially dealt a big blow to the modern art world, as the propaganda master did his best to undermine and stamp out any modern art that he considered degenerate. As a result of that, Dada artists, more so than anyone else, saw their works mocked, destroyed, or even their own selves in danger, and chose to escape the ever more dangerous situation in Europe to go to the United States. Experts widely agree that Dada's last big hurrah was in Paris in the early 20s, when several Dada pioneers took part in a series of exhibitions of provocative art, nude performances, all sorts of productions and manifestos. But even at that point, they fell to infighting and were moving on individually. So that was it. Dada had a tiny bit left in it and inspired some of the movements of the 50s, most obviously during the pop art era and neo-Dadaism. But its legacy lives on mostly through exhibitions and through select contemporary artists today. One of the most popular mediums and inventions to come out of Dada, as I mentioned, is the collage. So let's real quick cover what exactly collage, assemblage, and photo montage, all things that started in Dada, exactly mean. It comes from the French word coller, meaning to glue or stick together. It is, as I'm sure most of us know, a technique of art making where you stick paper, pictures, all sorts of things onto a surface in a specific arrangement. The National Gallery of Scotland credits French artist Dubuffet with coining the term in the early 1950s. They go on to say that it can include ribbon, paint, any pre-existing material, but when a work includes a noticeable, majority amount of 3D objects, that is when it is most likely referred to as assemblage. The Tate specifies that assemblage is art made by assembling disparate three-dimensional objects, often scavenged by the artist or bought specially. The term assemblage more specifically goes back to Pablo Picasso's Cubist constructions, the slightly three-dimensional works he began to make in about 1912. Another Dada artist in 1918 by the name of Kurt Schwitters began to use scavenged scrap materials to create collages and assemblages, though he called this technique mertz. Many of the Dadaists used collage, especially bits of pointed included text, to literally put different ideas or images together for various effects on the viewer. Scotland's National Gallery finally says assemblage became hugely popular with anti-art Dadaists who wanted to intertwine art with everyday life, but many surrealists also saw the potential for assemblage techniques to explore the subconscious mind and theories of Freud. Photomontage is a collage essentially just of photographs. Obviously, it is used in a much wider, broader way today, but that is how it originated. Next term, the Readymade. It itself is actually a ready-made. What I mean is that by the end of the 19th century, the term ready-made was being used to describe objects that were manufactured as opposed to being handmade. And that's exactly how they functioned in art. The term ready-made was first used by French artist Marcel Duchamp to describe the works of art he made from pre-manufactured objects. At times, the object is altered, but it's a somewhat universal term to describe artworks made in this way. Ready-made artworks not only aimed to kind of make fun of the art establishment, it also was trying to ask viewers very seriously what is considered art and why. How do we think about it? How do we appreciate it? The ready-made is one of the most, if not the most, iconic forms to emerge from Dadaism, and because it was practically synonymous with Marcel Duchamp, let's go ahead and talk about his most infamous one. But first, just a little background on who exactly Duchamp was. He was born in France in 1887, grew up in a bourgeois family that was extremely artistic. 3 of his siblings also became artists, and began formal art schooling in his late teens, early 20s. Duchamp's early works were clearly influenced by Manet, Matisse, Picasso, but he moved around a lot during the World War I and II years, mostly to and from the United States, and shifted into cinema and other fields after the start of the 1920s. The Met notes that most of his famous artworks are from the decade or so just before that, and in the 1920s, he in fact famously renounced art making in favor of playing chess for the rest of his life, though he never completely retreated from his identity, really, as artist provocateur. He died in October of 1968 in France, and his general legacy is one of humorous and witty takes on defying convention, on setting the stage for conceptual art. Like many artists, he was not overly popular during most of his lifetime and only began seeing fame and praise in the 1960s. As the Met says, quote, "Subverting traditional or accepted modes of artistic production with irony and satire is a hallmark of Duchamp's legendary career," end quote. We are going to circle back to his most famous ready-made, The Fountain, in just a second, but it's important to note that Duchamp was famous for going against the grain even before that incident. His nude descending a staircase, for example, numbers 1 and 2, were inspired by early stop-action photographic studies of motion. What's fascinating about the image is there's not actually a nude really visible. The work was rather famously rejected from the 28th Salon des Indépendants in February of 1912, even by friends of the Duchamp family. As scandalous as it was in Paris, it was a huge success in New York when it showed at an armory show there a year later. The center of the argument was the question, is this a dehumanizing way to present a female nude? And the debate was so heated, cartoon parodies of it appeared in local papers, and the entire world was talking about it. This is what prompted Duchamp to claim he would stop painting at the age of 25. So, The Fountain, made in 1917, it's literally just a work made of a men's urinal placed with the back serving as the bottom and the bottom sticking up into the air. According to the Philadelphia Museum of Art, Smithsonian Magazine, and several others, the story goes as such. In late 1916, the Society of Independence plans a large exhibition for the following April, deciding along the way that it would not be a jury-based show. So you wouldn't have to have your work approved by a judge to participate. You only had to pay the application fee. Duchamp, sensing an opportunity, I'm guessing, goes down to a plumbing supply shop on Fifth Avenue, buys a porcelain urinal, signs it R. Mutt, titles it Fountain, and submits it to the exhibition. Some of the show organizers are so offended that they supposedly could not sleep for 3 whole days. Others were just confused, and the work ended up rejected. Duchamp then resigns as chairman of the exhibition committee, and in support of this supposed stranger, pens a defense of the work as well. The publicity that arises over this whole thing is what cements Duchamp's name into art history. He was able to create a famous uproar at the time, and that piece still causes outrage today. Maybe because it is a toilet piece, and we are still hesitant to admit that we find potty humor funny. Of course, immediately following its rejection, the art world splits into a debate, artists and intellectuals on both sides. However, an anonymous editorial, believed to be written by the artist Beatrice Wood, makes the strongest points and kind of settles it for everyone. Her statement is such, quote, "Whether Mr. Mutt, with his own hands, made the fountain or not has no importance. He chose it. He took an ordinary article of life, placed it so that its useful significance disappeared under the new title and point of view, created a new thought for that object." End quote. Wood had long studied Duchamp's work and practice and recognized the groundbreaking potential of Fountain. And I think she was inclined to look for significance because there is some there. In fact, that title Fountain is an intentional, tongue-in-cheek reference to both the purpose of the urinal as well as to famous fountains designed by Renaissance and Baroque artists, which are and have always been considered fine pieces of artistry themselves. It completely embodies Dada's disregard for traditional artistic values and especially production techniques. And our story goes on to note that its influence on 20th century artists such as Jeff Koons, Robert Rauschenberg, Damien Hirst, and others is incalculable. Importantly, Fountain is one of only 13 ready-mades that Duchamp ever made, as he realized that their power and their value would go down the more of them that he made. Though ready-mades were initially critiqued and dismissed by critics, they had a fascinating effect on the definition of art object. In Duchamp's opinion, by World War I, most of his fellow artists were focused on so-called retinal art. They wanted only to please the eye. Duchamp saw this as his way to differ himself, to focus more on concept and idea, to work on the mind through art. Fountain and the ready-made were giant challenges to the so-called necessity of the artist's hand. In art history, a lot of times a thing has value because it was touched by an artist, because they specifically painted, sculpted, whatever, did it. Duchamp's Fountain, with the only sign of his interaction with it being a signature, asked, do we need proof of authorship in the age of mass production? How can we tell individual style? It's a series of questions that the world was just beginning to become aware of and maybe not ready to answer. Duchamp's Fountain also pushed a lot of other boundaries by asking, what can be art? What are appropriate inclusions or forms of it? And that question has evolved over the years as well. It makes appropriateness a meta concept. What is appropriate, to whom, and when? This appropriateness question is all the more important when we consider the fact that even though Duchamp and Readymade are pretty much synonymous, he was not the inventor. He was not the first one to do it. That honor, according to the New York Times, actually belongs to Baroness Elsa von Freytag-Loringhoven, who did it all, Readymade's writings, etc., on her arrival to the U.S. 2 years before Duchamp. But because she was an extremely poor, widowed woman, she soon had to go back to Berlin to work, where she died in an apparent accident only a few years later. So, what a fascinating history that we have Duchamp, who was criticized for it in a way that made him successful only a few years after we have Baroness von Freytag-Loringhoven essentially dying on the street out of lack of recognition and criticism for very similar artistic work. Really makes you think about those double standards. One last thing about the fountain before we move on. The one at the Philadelphia Museum of Art is not actually the original. That was soon lost or destroyed. The one in their collections is based off of a series of confirmed photographs on a pedestal on display in the early 1920s. Another crucial Dada figure, though she is much less known than Duchamp, Hannah Hoch. The German artist lived from 1889 to 1978. She was a pioneer of political collage and photomontage and an early Dada group member and exhibitor. She had the rare opportunity to study at the Berlin College of Arts and Crafts and was among the first to explicitly expand conceptions of art through found element incorporation. Early in her career, she demonstrated a gift for appropriating propaganda images towards her own socio-political agenda. She artistically mocked the concept of the new woman ideal, which was very heavy on the concept of women are homemakers. According to the MoMA, she once wrote, quote, "Most of our male colleagues continued for a long while to look upon us as charming and gifted amateurs, denying us implicitly any real professional status," end quote. So she clearly had a sense of how she was marginalized for not only her independent spirit, but her confrontation of gender issues and the fact of her cisgender presentation. MoMA goes on to note that she was included in the first International Dada Fair in Berlin in 1920, and her photomontages received critical acclaim despite some patronizing views from her male peers, end quote. Though, as we talked about, the 1920s saw the end of the European Dada group, she continued to make work throughout the Nazi regime, despite an exhibition ban, because the regime saw her as a producer of degenerate art. She fled to the German countryside and after the war began exhibiting again. Her significant contributions to German avant-garde were recognized in the 70s and have been ever since. She passed in 1978 in Germany. As I said, Hoch's most well-known works are social critiques, for example, those of traditional roles of women or popular culture, as well as political ones, for example, the failings of her government, the Weimar Republic. She was one of the first Dadaists to explicitly and self-consciously describe the goals and effects of incorporating found elements of popular culture into higher art. As Art Story puts it, quote, "Her inclusion of commercially produced designs in her montages broke down distinctions between modern art and crafts, between the public sphere and domesticity," end quote. She is especially noted in art history for her splicing and recontextualizing skills, her dynamic layered style, and her sheer indomitability going against the political and the social grains. Hoch's most famous work from 1919 through 1920 is titled "Cut with the Kitchen Knife Through a Beer Belly of the Weimar Republic." The work is an intentional nonsense narrative made through visual connections of images by their placements in relation to each other. In the top right corner, there are images of anti-Dada figures of the Weimar Republic and representatives of the old empire. They face off against photographs of proponents of Dada who are ranged kind of opposing these establishment figures. The piece was exhibited in the first International Dada Fair, taking place in Berlin in 1920, and was reportedly one of the most popular pieces from the show. It may have been so because Hoke was critiquing the male-dominated political apparatus that she believed resulted in the failure of the Weimar Republic and the increasing militarization in post-World War I Germany. She was no-holds-barred critiquing German culture by literally slicing apart its imagery and reassembling it into these vivid and disjointed, yet also emotional depictions of modern life. The title, too, of the piece refers to the decadence, corruption, sexism of pre-war German culture, and it is much more political and even physically larger than her typical montages. It explicitly highlights the polarity of Weimar politics by putting images of establishment people opposite from intellectuals, radicals, entertainers, and artists. Art Story in particular notes the map of Europe that identifies nations in which women had achieved the right to vote, saying that it could suggest the newly enfranchised women of Germany would soon cut through the male beer belly culture. Artland magazine notes, however, that her peers did not get a free pass. The image is flooded with parts that suggest Hoke believed that both the leaders of the Weimar Republic as well as the leaders of Dada saw the role of women to be the same. In her eyes, though many male Dadaists had lots of good ideas about gender equity and how to go about it, they didn't ever enact these theories or goals, and so Hoke used the work to showcase her frustration with their empty promises. Next, let's talk a little bit more about the chance element of Dadaism by going into the work of John, aka Hans Arp. He's got those two names because he is kind of German as much as he is French. He was born in 1886 in Alsace-Lorraine, which has long passed between German and French control and back again. Likely because of this, he became very comfortable with duality and developed a sort of hybrid cultural identity that repelled any divisiveness, and that even showed up in his artistic practice as he moved between movements, styles, and materials. He worked primarily in Dada surrealism and aligned sometimes with other artists in those areas. And something we both learned today, according to the MoMA, Arp's early works of biomorphic forms were inspired by organic material and the human figure. They later proved to be a big influence and area of exploration for none other than Joan Miro. Eventually, however, he began to limit those biomorphic forms to his sculptural works. One of many who fled to Switzerland during World War II, at some point he married fellow artist Sophie Tober Arp, whose work was always overshadowed by her husband's fame. Though the art world has gradually come to recognize the importance of her work as well, especially as a multidisciplinary one. He took great inspiration from her works, especially her sculpture, and took a long break from his career after her death in 1942. Arp passed in 1966, and MoMA says of his legacy, quote, "In his collages, reliefs, and sculptures, Arp often incorporated waste materials such as discarded paper and fabric and embraced chance and spontaneity as integral components of the artistic process," end quote. Arp's possibly most famous and most recognizable works, aside from his sculptures, are his paper pieces, I guess you could call them. More specifically, I'm referring to Untitled of 1917, also sometimes called Squares Arranged According to the Laws of Chance. Though he made several versions of the work over the years, they all have the same basic philosophy and process behind them, so we'll use this as a case study. With this one, it's especially important to remember Dada philosophy. They were critiquing systems that shaped society. They were turning to new art-making strategies. They were attacking rationality by embracing, looking to include chance, accident, improvisation. Their art was more or less a result of blaming reason and rationality for World War I. So, Arp decides he's going to create abstract compositions by dropping cutout paper shapes randomly onto a background and just gluing them down where they land. He argued this means of chance abstraction was a way to get rid of any subjectivity in his art. Rumor has it that this was the technique Arp used when he became frustrated by attempts to more formally try and compose geometric arrangements. They were a representation of Dada's claim to be anti-art. I feel for Arp though, because as much as he was aiming for unconscious and non-intellectual creativity, he just could not defeat the perfectionist in him. Though MoMA does agree the work is non-referential, there's no story, no picture here, the grid-like composition, they say, is evidence in and of itself that he did not let them be totally controlled by gravity. Material studies have also shown that he used heavyweight, possibly fine art papers, and that the edges were torn on a slant to reveal their inner fibers. So, despite Arp's best intentions and even a little bit of our own art history lessons, we have to realize that this work might be only a visual representation of chance and not actually a product of it. There are several other big names, especially Man Ray and his Ingrace's violin, or Hugo Ball and his sound poem Caruana from 1916, that I really wanted to go into, that I would love to go into. But as the episode is already getting quite long, we shall go ahead and start catching back up to the present, getting back to the evolution of assemblage and other Dadaist concepts. So time passes on, we go through the 20s and 30s, through surrealism, social realism, abstract expressionism, start getting into pop art, and here is where we again see Dada ideas and influence pretty clearly. The Tate points out that the mid-century, the 1950s and 60s, were the time of the assemblage, or at least the second time, the second coming, the whatever you want to call it. They say that artists like Jasper Johns, Robert Rauschenberg, and others adopted very anti-aesthetic approaches to making art, using scrappy materials and found objects alongside kind of messily applied paint to create very expressionist reliefs and sculptures. That earned them the name Neo-Dada. The Arte Povera movement emerged from Italy, and those artists made their works using assemblages of throwaway natural and everyday materials from soil to rags, with the aim of challenging and disrupting the values of the commercialized contemporary gallery system. They were contemporaries of pop art, but rather than focusing on the machine age and mass productions, they focused on deliberately so-called poor natural materials. But the ideas of performance arts carried on, with Alan Capro as an example. He was an American artist and an influential figure who incorporated tons of found objects into his various performances and so-called happenings, which were essentially installations open to anyone in the public who heard about them and showed up. Caprow also produced pioneering and important texts on the art movements of the 1960s. Collage, of course, has continued to be an extremely important and widespread art medium, both by fine artists as well as casual practitioners, hobbyists. In addition, as a technique, assemblage continues to be extensively used, for example, in sculptures of various artists like Sarah Lucas, Damien Hirst, the artist Ellen Atsui. Other ideas from Dada echo through the decades into this century as well. We see a lot of questions regarding AI and the artist's hand, for example, how important it is to know whether something was mass-produced and in what context it's important to have that information. But more than anything, the legacy and the power that Dada artists gave to those who came after is the ability to work beyond any traditional confines and limitations, and to be able to successfully argue that doing so is art, if nothing else, on the basis of precedent. All right, honeys, that is our Dada and Readymade story, our episode. I hope you enjoyed our featured artists and artworks. Hope you learned a little something. And I will be back again Tuesday with a brand new business. Take care of yourselves, have a lovely weekend, and stay hydrated for sure. It's hot out there. This podcast was created, produced, written, hosted, edited, and fact-checked by Master's graduate Celia Bugno. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe on all of your favorite streaming platforms as well as your social medias.